I'm one of the co-founders of Origin. Prior to that, I had actually published through a couple of other companies, California Pacific and Sierra. And in both of those cases, those companies, in the middle of selling a top-selling game, they quit paying me. And so that was pretty good impetus to go do something a little different. And it was my brother Robert's idea to start Origin. He said, at least I know if you go into business with me, when we get a check-in from the sale of a game, the first person I will pay is the author. And I said, wow, that's a better business practice than I've been accustomed to. And so that is literally what started Origin. And interestingly, I think it is that founder is an independent author for the company, and another brother is the manager of the company. That dynamic of the two of us constantly fighting over what was fair and being co-founders helped keep Origin to be a very author-oriented company. That I think really benefited the growth of the company, because every other author that came used my contract as the basis of their negotiation. So I had the worst deal, and yet I had leverage to make sure I didn't get a bad deal. And so that kind of set up what Origin became, and through the works of the people around the table, plus Chris, we had a 10 or 20 year run of creating worlds, which I think turned out pretty darn good.
Your turn, Paul.
Paul, you want to go next?
Yeah, I'm Paul Neurath. So I got in the games industry in the mid-'80s, 1980s, and started as an independent developer. And the first game I did with Surtech Software, the guys who were doing the Wizardry games, was a space combat game in 3D. And that's how I cut my teeth. I learned how assembly language programming and got up to speed on the Apple II. When that game was finished, I wanted to do another space-themed game, and that was Space Rogue. And that's where I really connected up with Richard and Robert, Origin, Dallas. They were actually in southern New Hampshire at the time, and I was in just about half hour south in Massachusetts. And I had finished playing, I think it was Ultima 3, and I noticed on the back of the box that they were a short drive away. So I just drove up one day and introduced myself, and it was a great next 3 or 4 years where we all collaborated together. I was one of the independent authors who was working with Origin. I completed Space Rogue, and got to work with Richard and Dallas, Chuck Boucher a little bit in the early year or two. Chris Roberts, and we all learned from each other, and it was a very it was a great experience. I think we learned from each other's craft, and then Origin ended up for some reason Richard has something against cold weather, so he wanted to move down to Austin, Texas. So the company ultimately moved down there, and that became an impetus to start my own studio, which became Looking Glass. It started as Blue Sky in 1990. We 2 years later renamed it to Looking Glass. And first game we did was Ultima Underworld.
Let's see, like Richard, I started out as a freelancer in the business. I got started programming, writing engineering software on my Apple for Brown and Root Construction, an international paper in Louisiana. And I got enamored with the games on the Apple, and quit that job, went to work for the computer store in Shreveport, Louisiana that sold me the Apple, bought all the games that were on the marketplace, including the Ultimas. I think Ultima 1 and 2 were the only ones out at that time. This was 1980, 81. And really just got hooked. And I sold a bunch of Apples. One of them was a fabulous artist who was a captain in the Air Force there in Shreveport. He drew some beautiful pictures. I said, Joe, we got to do a game based on these pictures. He drew like Boris Vallejo, who did a lot of the Tarzan covers in comics and whatnot. And so we did. We threw something together in about 6 months, which is all it took back in those days. The first publisher we showed it to, which was Penguin Software, picked it up. It went on to be their #1 best-selling game. It's called The Quest in 1983. just like Richard as well, they decided that they were paying us too much money. And we had already signed a contract for the sequel, Ring Quest, had already finished Ring Quest. We said, no, we're not going to change. They wanted to change that contract, both contracts for both games, and reduce the royalty. We said, well, that just doesn't make sense. We don't think so. So what they did was they blackballed Ring Quest and refused to publish it by just doling out problems. Oh, it's got this problem. You got to fix this. You got to fix it. And they stretched it out for 2 years. Now, by that time, I'd already run out of the good revenue from the Quest. It was kind of broke, and had a family to support. And the only guy I knew in the industry was Dave Albert, who at that time had quit his job as the producer at Penguin and went to work for the Garriott brothers as their vice president of product development. I called him up and said, Dave, I need a job, man. And he said, well, come on up and talk to everybody. So I did, and wound up hitting it off with these guys, both of them for different reasons. I can relate to both the Garriotts, the business side and the creative side. And that's when I first met Paul Neurath. This was 1985. And I drove all the way from Shreveport, Louisiana, to join them up there. I just want to say real quick, it turned out that Shreveport kind of became a breeding ground for a lot of developers. One of them that also joined, two of them that joined us at Origin. One was Greg Malone, who did
Mobius,
yes, which is another good selling game. And I helped start a users group in Shreveport that wound up hiring a couple of young teenagers to help them work on some stuff. The group is called Soft Disk, and the guys they hired were John Carmack and John Romero as teenagers. And y'all know where they went on to. John actually joined us for a little while, maybe less than a year, up in New Hampshire. And I helped him build one game, and then I got stopped making games as a programmer. Ogre was the only one I actually wrote any code on, other than snippets.
We published Ring Quest.
That's true.
Origin published Ring Quest.
They did publish Ring Quest, the one that Penguin refused to, was blackballing me on. And I went into management after that, and became the producer and then the executive producer of 40 of the games that we did at
including
Origin.
these.
And it was me and Richard that suckered Warren Spector into quitting TSR and joining us. And he hooked up with Paul and became a producer for Paul's products, including Ultima Underworld.
Well, I played D&D games, paper, pen and paper D&D going back to about 75. And, was a fan of the fantasy literature, Tolkien and everything else. And I played a lot of the fantasy and role-playing games. So I played, each Ultima that came out, and the Wizardries, and all the classic fantasy role-playing games. And a few of them, like Wizardry and Bard's Tale and the Ultimas, had dungeon exploration as often a part of them. The earlier Ultimas was done with a 3D perspective, but back then it was kind of a faked 3D perspective because the technology wasn't able to generate, a true first-person, real-time, fluid experience. So they were like Wizardry, or it was line drawings, and you typically took, you stepped like 10 feet and turned 90 degrees at a time. So it was very abstracted, still a lot of fun. In I think it was about 89, I started experimenting with 3D texture mapping on an Apple IIgs, which was basically a turbocharged Apple II. And as I remember, I could get one texture map scene to render, very simple scene, 3D texture map scene. It took about 3 or 4 seconds to render a single image. So it wasn't anything that was pragmatic for the Apples of that time. But then when with the IBM PC, more powerful and having more horsepower, come 1990, it seemed that you could actually pull this off and do a real-time fluid 3D environment. And so when I started Blue Sky in early 1990, within a couple of months we had a prototype just to prove, because we weren't sure it could happen, but we tried it out, and we were rendering just simple dungeon corridors that you could run through in full 3D texture mapped environment, which had never been done with personal computers before. People had done, Lasseter and others had done texture mapping on, graphics workstation, but it wasn't a technology that had, made the leap to personal computers. So we were sort of on, we're on the cutting edge there. But the vision behind that was to create a more immersive experience. When I pen and paper role play or read, Lord of the Rings, my mind's eye is in that world as if I'm really there. And I think that's true for, most people who, get into this literature or do the gaming. And so that goal of really submersing you into that fantasy environment as if you were really there was a core part of the experience we want to try to deliver. So that's really where the vision came from. And then we wanted to do as a role-playing game. And, I love the Ultimas and the role-playing games. So, we wanted to wrap it in this context of, you being a fantasy character who could develop and grow and skills and explore in a whole narrative. So that's where it all came from. Well, I think we started development in early spring of 1990, and for about 6 months we were developing it as just Underworld. That was our name for it. And we didn't have a publisher yet. I mean, we knew we were going to get a publisher, but because it was such a new concept and we were taking a lot of technical risks, we wanted to make sure that we could pull it off and had a prototype. So we worked on it it was about 5 or 6 months. We had a good prototype that was pretty cool to show that they could work and what the concept would be, and start to show it to publishers and including Origin, because I worked closely with Origin, had huge respect for Origin, and Richard and Dallas and Warren, they saw the potential for this and really wanted to work with it. And Richard, I think it was you who suggested, that we put in the Ultima fiction, which I think was a great approach, because it gave it an instant sort of, particularly for a game that's so groundbreaking in terms of technology and approach, to ground that in something that the fans already know, so that the entire experience is not 100% novel. There's sort of an approachability there and something that's already understood. And so we ended up folding in, we set it in, the Underworld was set in an island in Britannia, and, we brought in some of the characters and some of the back fiction, and that created the back fiction context for it.
And, if I could throw in some thoughts here too, when we did see that demo, when all of us who go back to paper gaming, and then made this conversion over into computer gaming, the computer offered two big advancements. One was it was the game master, so it could determine what would happen next, what monsters you would face, what problems you would face. But another one was the visualization, and in that instead of only seeing things in your mind's eye, the computer could begin to simulate what that world would actually look and feel like. And at least for me in Ultima Land, we were always using either tile graphics or these line-drawn dungeons. And so we were falling, I think we were making a rich interactive world, but we were falling well short of the hypothetical virtual reality that we've still never reached. And but when Underworld, when Paul showed that demo, everyone realized this was now finally the first really big step into not just visualizing the world, but he also had some other innovations in user interface, where we were just emerging out of the era of keyboard-only interfaces. Early Ultimas, you'd hit the letter A for attack, B for board a vessel, C for cast a spell, D for drop an item, etc. through 26 letters. And Paul had made a truly mouse-centric user interface that allowed a level of engagement into this newly realized virtual world in a way that had never been done before. And so we were really excited about what a statement this was to the industry about where role-playing games could go.
And in terms of the IP, we had already started down a path of trying to capitalize more on the Ultima IP. It was our largest investment from a standpoint of technology. We had Warren Spector, the producer of Underworld, was already his first job as a producer was on a Worlds of Ultima product called Martian Dreams. And we had another Worlds of Ultima product called Savage Empire. And now this particular product was not considered a Worlds of Ultima product, but we were already in the frame of mind that we were trying to find ways to utilize that IP beyond just the Ultimas that Richard would push out.
Well, because one of the things that companies like EA have done very well with things like their sports franchises is they come out with a new Madden football every year at the beginning of football season, and it makes as many improvements as you can manage to squeeze in one season. And so you just keep iterating on that engine. Well, with role-playing games, not just mine, but every one of us in the role-playing game business, we would often take 2+ years to make one role-playing game. And so that actual cycle is not the best from a marketing standpoint. And so that's why we were looking for ways we could continue releasing properties that were related to each other on more like a yearly basis as opposed to a multi-year basis. And so we all kind of got together and said, look, since it's going to, we're not going to step on each other's toes because we're too many years apart, and we were developing. Ultima remained developing in the tile graphic. Ultima 1, 2, 3 remained in the tile graphic environment, and that left this opportunity to really explore the more virtual reality methodologies that Underworld represented.
Yeah, in the Worlds of Ultima, the other thing they shared in common was we actually reused the tile graphic technology from an Ultima. So I think that Martian Dreams was based on Ultima 6 technology, whereas Ultima Underworld was totally unique technology in itself. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, the teams tend to be much smaller. I mean, going into 1990, we had 5 people on the team for most of the Ultima Underworld development, making the game. And compare that to a AAA, PC or console game today that might have, 100 plus people on it. So, you had much smaller teams. The platforms, working on an IBM of that era was less powerful than, your cell phone. And so you had very significant hardware constraints that you had to build around. And a lot of your design decisions and technology decisions were constrained, and you had to design around those based on the hardware that you have. So the original Ultima Underworld, we barely got 3D texture mapping working, and one of the ways we could pull it off is the original Ultima Underworld. The rendered screen was only about a third of the VGA screen on a PC. We had to create UI elements all around it. We originally wanted to create a full screen experience because we knew that would be more immersive. But when we tried full screen, we got down to about 3 frames a second. Instead, that's not going to work. So there's a lot of constraints that you had to design around and sort of smoke and mirrors to work around those elements. So and a lot of the engineering, the software engineering, got into the real, the hardware and the weeds. We didn't have, there were no rendering cards back then. So all of the rendering was done in software. We had to write assembly language, texture mappers and image warpers and shaders, and it was very specialized coding to make that all work.
What I find interesting about the moment in time we're in right now is, to me, even though it's not exactly come full circle, it has returned to its roots in some very important ways. All of us here go back to the time where our earliest games we made, by ourselves. Literally one person made one game, and you were the designer, the programmer, the writer, the artist. You did everything. But a lot of the sweet spot, the first Underworlds, the middle Ultimas, the emergence of Wing Commander, those were games where we at least did have a team. But the teams were still relatively manageable, and the years of development was relatively manageable, and the millions of dollars required to make a game was relatively manageable. We're now at the point where, there are a lot of the games made by large studios now are spending truly hundreds of millions of dollars, truly 5+ years, and there's a lot of incredibly notable failures. And so I'm actually not sure it's a better time. I actually think it's, when games take 5+ years and they're that big, your career will only have a handful of games in it, at that point. And the risk rewards, the pain to reach the end and the risk reward of even a success is not nearly as fulfilling as a lot of those earlier times were, at least to me. And one of these great aspects of the new era of crowdfunding and community involvement within the development cycle, and using engines for some of us in that case, which saves a fair bit of time and money in our case, that has actually now allowed us to go from hundreds of persons on a team down to a couple of dozens of people on a team. And I have to tell you, that just feels so much nicer, combined with the fact that we'll be able to produce a game now in a few fingers of a hand number of years, as opposed to multiple hands. And I think that is, at least for me, something I'm really enjoying about the modern era of community-supported games.
Well, it's really the matter of the funding, because I can guarantee you that if we were, bringing in double our crowdfunded revenue for this game, we would spend it all. We would double our team size, and we would deal with the headache because our friggin' creativity of the teams. There's so much more they want to do than the budgetary constraints. Now, you take something like Star Citizen, that has generated a $70 million crowdfunded campaign, and you can see that they've grown to that size because Chris always grew to whatever size that his budget was, starting with the very first game he did with us, which was Times of Lore, and then the second one, Bad Blood, and then third one where he really hit his stride with Wing Commander, and then his budget just kept growing and the team size just kept growing. So I'll have to agree with Richard, though. It certainly is less stress, and you're able to actually enjoy the process a bit more when the team size is, less than 30. Once it gets beyond that, it gets a little...
You have departments.
Yeah, it takes a little bit of the fun out of it. But there's other downsides to it as well, which is you don't always get to realize the full design of the product that you really wish you could build.
I knew John Romero because he worked overlapped with me at Origin. As Dallas said earlier, he was at Origin for, I think it was about a year. It wasn't a long time, but he had an office. It was just a few offices down for where I was working out of at the time, probably in the late 80s. And so I got to know John, and like John, we had a lot of common interests in terms of gaming. And after he left Origin, I kept in touch. When I started up Blue Sky in 1990, we were corresponding, and we'd send each other kind of updates on what we were each working on. In John's case, he had joined up with John Romero, and it was getting going. And so I remember he sent me a build of, I think it was called HOVERTANK, which was one of their very early 3D games that they were working on. And it was kind of a wizardry kind of look, but fluid. And it was their kind of early stabs at trying to do a first-person gaming. And around the same time, I was sending them, keeping them updated on stuff we were doing, and including showing that early prototype we had by the summer of 1990 of Underworld, which had all the texture mapping and all. And so I'm pretty certain that both Johns saw that demo. And I remember, coming across at least one of them at a CES show, and I think it was 1990, and showing them the demo. And so, I don't know what degree that John Carmack got inspired by kind of knowing what we were working on, but we were publicly starting to show this stuff by the mid 1990, and I'm sure that he picked up on that and thought about, well, what can I do with this technology? And they ended up doing with through Wolfenstein the first shooter style gameplay. And they used a ray casting technology. It wasn't true texture mapping. It wasn't a true 3D in the sense that you couldn't look up or down or rotate the view, move in 3 space entirely. It was sort of 2.5D. But the advantage of limiting it to 2.5D was that they could run at a higher frame rate, which was good for a shooter. So they went down the path of kind of creating the shooter category with Wolfenstein 3D and then Doom, where we always had a vision for creating a role-playing game that went, for us, was much more than just about the 3D rendering itself. Commercially, it ended up doing better than us. It turned out there was more of a mass market, larger audience for a pure shooter. But I've never regretted the direction we took.
Yeah, I find it interesting also to reflect on. There were some very early developers. If I had to describe somebody as my mentor, unbeknownst to him, other than hearing me say this comment since, was a guy named Bill Budge. And even back in the Apple II days, he could do 3D work on the Apple II that wasn't even often line drawings. It was often just a few points hovering in space. But he could do enough points to represent a space shuttle, free tumbling or orbiting another planet. Also, just enough dots to make it clear of what it was, but always in real time. And it was always so far ahead of what I could do. It was one of these things where the gap was too large for me to personally cross. Technically, I really frankly wasn't up to it, which is one of the reasons I stuck with tile graphics. It was one of the things I could do. It was Underworld was the first time that I saw somebody take the 3D technology that we knew was going to emerge, that I had already seen the taste of it through people like Bill Budge, and now go out of just dots or lines like I had done line drawing dungeons, and take that now to really a true fully rendered 3D. So that was a very magical moment.
Most of the development was done, the core development was done in Blue Sky. We had offices up in New Hampshire at the time, in southern New Hampshire. But we did. There was a tight collaboration with Origin and the guys down in Austin. Warren was our producer, and Warren's always had a really deep vision and insight into game design, and so he was extremely helpful in helping us refine and work through some of the creative issues as we were getting further along in the project. Richard had a lot of insight and was really helpful in thinking about how we tie the gameplay to the fiction and the story, because that's the thing about the Underworlds, which is they're not just a 3D dungeon experience. You're really immersed in this fantasy world that seems real and is believable and engages you for hours. And it's its own microcosm, and a big piece of that is the narrative and the story and the characters. And a lot of that was informed from Richard and the work he had been doing and was doing on the Ultimas. So there's a lot of learning and sharing that was going on.
Yeah, and I'll throw in some big kudos for Warren also. I've been on record many times saying that I think the best Ultimas I produced were the Ultimas I produced with Warren. And Warren was really the link between us as well. And where I think where Ultimas went from being just a game to a valuable intellectual property really started with Ultima 4, where I brought in the virtues, and that was really myself, so to speak. But then starting with 5 and 6 and 7, which is where I began to work with Warren and where we began to also collaborate, it was really Warren's far superior story craft and his experience in game design that really came from paper games for balance and scenario, all those things that make a game go from just being a tech demo into being a rich, real place to live and breathe and desire to be. Warren really helped us both immensely on that front. Let me take that one first, Paul, just because let me give you a little prehistory if I could. Back when we formed Origin in my parents' garage in Houston, the reason we chose the word Origin and not Excalibur or something more fantasy-oriented was we weren't sure if Origin was going to just make games or might make operating systems or might make hardware. And we actually experimented with hardware. The Apple II had the ability to run 4 paddles, like a Pong paddle. or 2 joysticks. But no one ever manufactured a dual joystick for like Crazy Climber kind of stuff. So we actually made a prototype dual joystick. We also made a prototype of something I have an image of around in the office here. We made a wooden enclosed 360-degree gimbaled simulator that made it to we never finished it. We only got to the point of being incredibly dangerous before we decided this was probably a bad idea.
The nauseator?
The nauseator, exactly, the nauseator. And so when any virtual reality device came out, anybody that sold either a head tracking set of 3D goggles or flicker goggles to look at a screen or a full head mounted display, we bought every one of those. We as a company and me as an individual, I would always describe myself as a huge virtual reality enthusiast, but I remain a huge virtual reality skeptic. I have so often thought, okay, well this one's surely going to be way better, and we're now to the point where they are way better than they've ever been before. But in my mind, virtual reality requires either the Matrix plug-in or a cave that is perfectly simulating
A holodeck.
a holodeck something. We're still not there yet, but now I'm curious what Paul really thought of the phrase virtual reality with regard to Underworld.
So we weren't thinking seriously about VR goggles and the like when the Underworlds were developed. Again, this was 1990 through 93 when we wrapped up the Underworld 2. We did it Looking Glass, though, because in 93, 94, we changed the name to the studio to Looking Glass. And we started working on, one of the games we were working on was Flight Unlimited, which came out in 1995. And so a few years later, that's when, as far as I know, the first generation of consumer VR headsets were being made available. And we actually supported a couple of those headsets it was around 95, 96, I think, for Flight Unlimited and another game we were doing at the time, Terra Nova, which was a science fiction 3D game. And what we found with that generation is that the devices just weren't ready for consumers. They gave you headaches to wear them for most people for more than a few minutes. They were so laggy and the resolution was so poor. They were, years away from being anything that you'd actually want to use as a consumer. They were fun for a tech demo. We had fun using, kind of supporting them, but they weren't anything that we could use commercially. And obviously, with Oculus Rift and other headset manufacturers getting a ton of attention over the past year or two, there's this new wave, new generation, and we're intrigued, and we're playing with these devices and trying to figure out. I do think that Underworld, the new version, Underworld Ascendant, the time because we got a little work to do yet before the game's done. So by the time the game is done, it might be right to really put it in that VR environment. Have that as one way to play it. We're certainly exploring that.
We can't help but explore it. It's just too dang fun. As soon as the Oculus Rift 1 came out, and we got one here at the office as a prototype, first thing the Shroud of the Avatar team did was create take our map and put it into their system. And we just all started taking turns around the office, walking around our Shroud of the Avatar map at that time. And it was amazing. It was just truly amazing. But then, we have the immediate complication of how do we interact with the game, because we can't see the keyboard, we can't see our hands. And it didn't stop us from having fun with walking around the visuals, though. So I'm very much on Richard's camp, which is very excited and want to be tremendously enthusiastic about this as a gaming system, but very skeptical of how it's going to work until we have a holodeck.
Well, I think for VR to take off for games and work well, it's not just about supporting a headset. There's a lot more to VR than that. You need the controllers that work well with it to give you a sense of, okay, now I'm in this 3D environment. How can I control it and feel like I'm moving around in the environment and taking actions in an immersed way? because a joypad, a joystick just doesn't really cut it for that kind of contextual interaction. And there's game design stuff to be done. This isn't just about rendering in a VR headset. There's a lot more thought to really making the full VR experience come across. So I think, we want to experiment. It's not just about the hardware. We also, are going to experiment with gameplay and interfaces to see what can work. And it's a question mark right now. We don't know how far we can push it or other people can push it, but it's a lot of fun to try.
That was an old working title, I think. Never actually made it.
Yeah, but
is that Tony Zurvak?
No, it was actually I think Ken Demarest was probably the longest period we had a lead on it. But yeah, it came out of when we were first had in-house 3D going. We talked about it being full VR. We had even built some very simple prototypes. I think it then switched to being called Green Guns for a while, because we all used to play laser tag in the office with these green guns, and so it morphed into that project for a while. But then we just finally concluded again that the combination of hardware and software really just still wasn't ready for prime time. So like these guys have been alluding to, I think the best VR game, when we finally get the right hardware, the best game for it is going to be a game that was designed for it. That actually won't play very well without it, rather than being a game that is just attached to it.
Now, this was after EA had purchased us, I'm pretty sure, and we had become part of their green lighting process, which we actually kind of welcomed because it brought some structure to how internal teams or individuals could propose ideas, and if they got past the idea stage, they were given a little budget and a little more team to go a little further. And Bounty Hunter must have made it through 3 or 4 of those processes, as you pointed out, before it was finally concluded.
Well, one thing to understand is Ultima Underworld 2 was, I believe, less than a year development cycle. It was 10 or 11 months. So it was a very quick sequel from the original one. And part of the goal there was to try to get something out, because we knew we had this groundbreaking technology with the original game. And so, the focus was, without really changing the engine and reworking the technology, can we get something out that, in terms of new story and narrative and setting, can leverage that? Because in the back of our minds, we all wanted to do push the engine and do some really cool stuff with the engine, but we knew that would take several years. So it was seen as something we could get out fairly quickly that would leverage this leading position we had just opened up in terms of the platform, while we're also thinking towards the next kind of full sequel, if you will. So I always viewed Ultima Underworld 2 as kind of like a 1.5 from that standpoint.
And so that bigger tech, that bigger rework of tech, that bigger rework of tech, it's only taken him about 20 years.
A little longer than we thought, 23 years. But, so with Ultima Underworld 2, the other thing is that now we were working, unlike the original, we started that, from day one with Origin, and so the Ultima fiction is more tightly, the Ultima fiction is more tightly bound, based in the second game. The other thing we did which was a narrative design experiment, which didn't work out as well as we had hoped in some ways. In other ways, worked great. The original Underworld was very much you're in a 8-level dungeon that you go from, deeper and deeper and deeper in the very classic dungeon crawl kind of configuration. For Underworld 2, we decided let's create a hub and spoke model where you sort of magically and otherwise go to these realms, and then you come back to the hub each time. In ways it was very freeing and allowed us to explore some different kinds of configurations and gameplay. But the downside is it didn't feel as cohesive, and I think it was harder for players to necessarily have a sense of place. So it was an experiment. We learned from it, no question. for everything you gets in the game, there's 3 or 4 or 5 things that you had to cut out. Making games is kind of like sculpture. You're cutting down until you get the core of what you can actually do for that game with the time and resources. And that's a good thing. Those constraints are good because it forces you to make decisions. But it also means there are some important things that you really wanted to be able to tackle that you can't. And so you put those in a big bucket, a huge bucket sometimes of we'll revisit this on the next game. So there was lots of stuff we wanted to do, and that's one of the things that's kind of neat now that it's 23 years later, but we had all kinds of plans for Ultima Underworld 3, and things that were all put on the back burner for a long time, and almost magically we can go revisit some of those things today. It's a long and complicated question. Maybe the short answer is that, and Richard, Richard and Dallas may probably have a better perspective on some of this than I do, but I think after Origin was acquired by Electronic Arts, and there were some changes in priorities for Origin as a studio, I think effectively it became harder for us at Blue Sky and then Looking Glass to figure out how we would work with Origin to do the next Underworld. And there was discussions about it, and we looked at it, but the green light process and getting EA, you had approval over all of that, there were extra hurdles. And so it just never, things never aligned to let that go forward. And it was kind of an odd contractual thing. I actually have, myself rights to future versions. And so it was one of these things where ultimately EA had the underlying rights to publish the game. I had certain creative rights. We sort of had to agree together to make anything new. And it just, we couldn't come to the, we couldn't make that happen. And so on various occasions, 3 or 4 times over the last 2 decades, there would be discussions about, let's do something with the Underworld franchise. And there'd be discussion and talk about it. And it was always tabled for, let's revisit this again. And it wasn't until this past year that finally that door got opened up. And in this case, we're actually able to bring it forward as an indie studio. We don't have the Ultima brand itself. EA has been doing Ultima branded games on their own, and they didn't want market confusion. That's my understanding. But we have all the IP. We can use anything from the original games. We just can't use the Ultima brand itself. We renamed the studio to Looking Glass and started working on, we did Ultima Underworld 2. And then we continue to work with other publishers, but we shifted our focus more to doing our own games. Our goal at Looking Glass was to try to, do what Origin had done and others to, grow into our own studio, could publish our own games. So Flight Unlimited in '95 was our first self-published game. And then we did Thief a couple years later. We did the 6 System Shock games, the first one which we did with Origin. That was actually an interesting game because that came out of, after Underworld 2, we said, let's do something in a very different genre. Let's do something that's, totally different from fantasy, science fiction, partly because we have been working on these fantasy games for going on 4 years, and we just, some of the team wanted to go in a different direction and try a different genre and take what we had learned from the from the Underworlds and apply that to a new genre, which is what System Shock was all about. So anyway, we ended up at Looking Glass doing, games like, System Shock and System Shock 2 and Thief 2 and Flight Unlimited. I mentioned we did a couple of Madden footballs. We did some golf games. We tried to, grow a fully self-sufficient developer and publisher. It was challenging then, and that was an era. This was getting into the later 1990s, where the large companies were really starting to, dominate, the Electronic Arts and the Activisions. And it was really challenging being a small publisher with only a few titles to be both a developer and a publisher. So it was a struggle for us. And ultimately we couldn't make that work, but we got some pretty wonderful games done. And after Looking Glass, I started up a new studio in 2000, Floodgate Entertainment, and I decided I wanted to try a whole new focus, which was mobile games. So we were doing some very early mobile games on feature phones. We did a set of Pirates of the Caribbean game, which was the first arena multiplayer game, as far as I know, on cell phones. We could have 8 players, kind of like League of Legends, fighting each other, teams of 8 players, and in little multiplayer arena battles. We did a Neverwinter Nights mobile game. We did some Madden mobile games. We were more focused because it was mobile, and particularly in those earlier days of mobile, having a big brand like Pirates of the Caribbean or Madden was pretty important. So we tended to develop games like that were based on a strong IP and well-known IP. We did that as a development studio for a number of years. I sold that studio to Zynga a few years ago, and then I did the whole social Facebook thing, which was very different. Learned a lot about that. But it's great to be back into core gaming and role-playing games. It's my passion, and so it's great to be back doing that.
It's interesting how Paul was mentioning taking a break from medieval fantasy. I did that same sort of thing. I lived in medieval fantasy from, really the mid-1970s up through basically 2000, and so that's 25 years in largely one virtual world. And so after that, after parting company with EA, I was actually very happy to do anything that was not medieval fantasy. And so that's why when we started Destination Games, which became part of NCSoft, we went in the directions of games like Tabula Rasa. And again, it was to have something more science fiction, or more specifically, not medieval fantasy, to at least take a break in that. Interestingly, like Paul, I missed it. It's absolutely true that as a gamer, I've always done fantasy gaming, and as a creator, I was eager to get back into fantasy gaming. So even though I had stepped away for one corporate cycle, very excited to be back in medieval fantasy again.
I'll just briefly add to that I was probably one of the first of the group of management at Origin that actually left Origin after we were purchased by Electronic Arts. I stayed on for about 3 more years, and then finally decided I needed to leave. I at that time was pretty burned out. So I went on a 10-year sabbatical, left the whole industry, and did a lot of research and study in the fields of psychology relating to happiness and well-being. And it was those studies actually, especially in the areas of how much of our well-being comes from social activities and from our social connections and relationships, that actually got me back in the industry. I kind of missed the MMO industry and its starting because we hadn't shipped Ultima Online yet when I left. And I was gone for the first 10 years of that MMO business. But then when I was studying this research again, and a lot of the research was actually being done by academicians who were pulling their data from MMOs, these online virtual worlds where they had massive amounts of data they could study, and I went, wow, okay, now I'm interested again. I wasn't burned out. My passion actually was figuring out how to incorporate this wealth of knowledge coming from social psychology into these massive quantities of relationships that are being created online and the interactions with each other. And I briefly joined Richard and Robert again at NCSoft, but that didn't work out real well for several of us. So we spun off, and I was actually the one that planted the seed for Portalarium, and talked Richard here into getting back together again so that we could both realize our passion, which was his for getting back into his roots and making a fantasy RPG, and me for wanting to be able to apply, a lot of the new science and technology that's coming out into actually making these games even more engaging, not just for the entertainment value of the story and the adventure, but for what you can have in doing it with other people. And then, like Paul, we made a bit of a misturn in that instead of immediately starting on Richard Shroud of the Avatar, and at that time we called it a Calabath Online, because he still had the rights for a Calabath, which was his very first role-playing game. It was the prequel to the Ultimas. And so that was our working title, a Calabath Online. Instead of working on that immediately, we thought we would do a couple of quick knockoff games in this Facebook social market. And we did a poker game, and we did Ultimate Collector. And we also joined up with Zynga to distribute our Ultimate Collector. Now, we got that out sometime in 2012, just at the time that the Facebook market was doing this, and Zynga was doing this. And we had to scramble. We had already spent all of our investor money, and this was when Richard and probably Chris Spears at the time was the champions of this new Kickstarter thing. Now, we'd all been watching Kickstarter for the last year and seeing things like Shadowrun and Brian Fargo's Wasteland and the kind of money they were getting. And we couldn't get any more investors to step up to the table, so we decided to kickstart it. And we got a lot of help from Brian Fargo and from Chris Roberts, who had actually done his own thing, both at Kickstarter and on his website. Matter of fact, we used some of the same software plugins for our website that Chris used on his site, so it was a big help there.
And even that sort of brings us all back again, with Paul. When we heard that Paul was thinking about making this turn, I find it both ironic and incredibly pleasing that there are a group of us who go back to what I think of as one of the first real golden eras of computer games that had worked together during one of the most productive, most creative, most innovative periods, where we saw games like Underworld, we saw games like the original Wing Commander, where Ultima really came into its own as an intellectual property, where Ultima Online was ushered in massively multiplayer. That era was I think very important to the industry and to all of us as individuals. We've spent now 10 or 15 years exploring activities independently. And while technically right now we have separate companies, each of us have our own companies, but all of us still feel that same tribal bond that we lived through this fire together. We've helped each other in the past. I think there's nothing more than we want to see for each other than to see each other succeed. Any way we can still tie our futures together, or at least take part of our future and give it to another one of the members of this tribe to make sure that their future also goes well, we want to do it. And so to me, this sort of feels like again, since we're technically separate companies, it's not like we've all come together to do this again, but we really have all come together to do this again. And so I think it's great that we, I think the only person that we need to get back around our table is Warren Spector, who's over there teaching out UT for a while. But if we could get him to come over and join us on this side of the fence, we'd have the whole, the majority of that Renaissance group.
He didn't have the benefit of, I had a 10-year sabbatical.
So he's on his now.
He may need 10 years away because he just left recently.
Yeah. He was pretty productive while the rest of us were on our hiatus.
He was, yes.
It's one of the most satisfying things to see. You make a game, you don't know what's going to happen to that game after you launch it, and the fact that we hear from players who are just discovering it, this past year for the first time, and really digging it, really getting into it. I would have never imagined that working on a game that would still hold up, more than 2 decades later. The graphics are quite primitive by today's standards, But once you get beyond the 1992 era graphics, I think the gameplay really holds up, and it's still very modern. I think there's some things that we were doing back then that really haven't been materially surpassed. Even there's been innovations, and the industry's moved forward more than just the graphics have all gotten phenomenally better, and production values have gotten phenomenally better. There have been absolutely innovations in gameplay. But when I think back to 1992, I thought there'd be a lot more innovations, and the interactive media, PC gaming would have pushed a lot further than it has. So I think it's cool that the game holds up, but there's a lot to be done. And I think it's still, if you look at the long vision here, the industry is still very young. We're still experimenting. And I think one of the cool things about this sort of renaissance of indie studios like, Portalarium and Other Side, RSI and our studios is that we can innovate in a way that, a lot of the big publishers and AAA teams can't necessarily. There's too many dollars at stake, or it's just a different model with going through retail. With digital distribution and crowdfunding, I think it opens the door to do the kind of fundamental innovations and really push this as a genre forward. And there's a lot of headroom left to do that.
Well, of course, we are deep in Shroud of the Avatar at this point, and unlike the early Ultimas, where when I was doing Ultima 1, of course it wasn't even called Ultima 1; it was called Ultima, and Ultima 2 and Ultima 3 were completely unrelated. They were different worlds, they were different IP. It was just my next fantasy game, and even 4, 5, and 6, it was sort of pick up where the last one left off. There was really no forward planning. At least this time with Shroud of the Avatar, I'm going. I at least hope that this game survives more than one iteration. So not only will we hopefully get Shroud of the Avatar more solidly in the user's hands, although it's already in its alpha form in the user's hands now, but not only will we get that completed here in this year to the users, but we have plans for episodes 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I've got at least 5 years, and that's if time goes. That's if we're really efficient. It might be 10 years if things go slowly, and it'll only be 5 or 10 years if the users grant us that privilege. But hopefully that's my next decade.
Yeah, and mine's very tightly linked to that. I wanted to start Portalarium not just as a one game company, which was also one of my passions at Origin, which was bringing on more teams, more products as we could support it. Now we had the luxury at Origin of already having a cash cow with Richard's Ultima series, which funded all of our other experiments. And then when we managed to adopt Chris Roberts into our Origin tribe, and he, in his third game did Wing Commander, we had 2 big cash cows, which allowed us to bring on more people and more teams and start at more projects. We had a pretty good hit record at Origin. About 1 out of every 3 products was successful marketably, as compared to maybe 1 out of 6 or 7 for the industry as an average. So my purpose at Portalarium is to continue to first of all make it sustainable with Shroud of the Avatar, and then as we can start growing it, letting internal people come up with different ideas to explore, as well as bringing on more that might be interested. Like you said, we definitely have our sights on Warren Spector long term to adopt him in. And then the other difference for me and Richard both, where Portalarium is concerned, was we're not viewing this as an exit strategy from the beginning. And Richard never did with the Origins and the Ultima, but his brother did, and a few of the other investors. For us, we'd be happy going to our graves with these games and with Portalarium together. It's like he said, once you're a member of a tribe and you've created that bond with each other, you never actually leave the tribe. And our goal is to make this company sustainable, even beyond ourselves, which we were too young to know how to do with Origin. We didn't know how to codify the culture that made it such an awesome place. And because of that, the culture eroded when us those of us who embodied the culture left. And that's it for me. Your turn, Paul.
Yeah, well, I'll pick up on that the culture in the sense of being part of a tribe, because it was certainly one of the things that I appreciated most about working with, Richard and Dallas and Warren at Origin, is that there was it was a great culture in a sense of being, you're all trying to push forward and create these wonderful games. And when I started my own studio with Blue Sky, Looking Glass, the thing that I was proudest about was the culture that we created there, and this group of developers who just shared this deep passion for making wonderful games. And it's the process that I like most. It's being involved and seeing these games go through their stages. They start with a vision, and that vision starts coming into, the pieces start falling into place, and you're solving the creative problems, and the team is gelling. Being there and doing it is, to me, the greatest reward. And so, with Other Side, it's an opportunity to do that again, and starting with this great franchise, the Underworld franchise. The team is really just incredibly psyched about it. Some of them have told me that this is the most fun, they've used the word joy, that they've had in many, many years. And that's where it's at. And I think great games come out of that. If you can create that culture and that sense that we're all in a shared mission to make this wonderful game for ourselves and for our fans, that's where it comes from. And that's what I enjoy most. And I want to continue to do that.
I want to add to that real quick when you mentioned the thing about the teams enjoying the development of the products. Back in the old days, and again now, we're actually, in my opinion, able to enjoy it slightly bit more now than we did even back in that golden era, because of this release cycle that we're on. Even back then, we would still work as a team for up to 2 years to create a game. And then when we were done, as a publisher, we'd throw it over the fence and cross our fingers and hold our breath and hope for the best. And if in product development, you're always running behind, always. And so you always feel like you're failing all the time because you're never getting it out as when you said you would for how much you said you would. And then if you pushed it out there and it wasn't received very well by the market or didn't sell that well, then you had disappointment, magnifying disappointment. The way we're doing it now, and I'm pretty sure Paul will probably adopt something similar with the new Underworld, is after about 8 months of development time, we pushed out our first pre-alpha release. And we did that by accident because we were supposed to have alpha out at that time. But remember what I said a second ago? We're always behind. We didn't have alpha anywhere close. So Star and Chris and Richard came up with this brilliant idea. It says, okay, it's not ready. We think it'll be ready in 3 months, but instead of waiting 3 more months, let's push out a little bit of it. And we did. And then the next month.
And that little bit was an avatar in a room.
With a chicken.
With a chicken. The chicken room.
The chicken room. They loved it. They didn't give us any flack at all, they being the community and the backers, about the fact that we didn't push out alpha when we said we would. They saw that, and at the same time we published a 3-month schedule and said next month we're going to push this out, next month we're going to push this out. Now we had thought by 3 or 4 months that, dropping my microphone here. We thought by 3 or 4 months that we would reach alpha. Well, it's 14 months later and we're still in pre-alpha release. But where you define alpha is secondary. So what I've observed in this team that we put together here at Shroud of the Avatar, and I'm sure you'll experience the same thing, Paul, and Star Citizen is getting to experience that too, because they're doing a similar model, perhaps not every month, but they're pushing out releases more than just waiting, for the game to be finished. The team actually feels a sense of achievement and accomplishment, even if we're getting criticism from our backers about they don't like this feature, they don't like that feature. There's enough of the features that they do love that the mixture of praise with criticism is very well balanced.
And very importantly, the criticism, if it comes in, it's usually on a system we've just exposed to them that's only partially completed, and we can correct it before the next release. And so it means everybody is happier along the journey.
They are. Probably at least a third of our backers are experiencing the game every month. There's a larger body of them that say they want to wait until the game is finished. But that third to a half that is experiencing it on a monthly basis is helping us guide the game, and they're actually feeding the souls of the team spiritually by playing the game on a monthly basis. And that is just really cool to see. While these backers are actually paying for the development at the same time. They're feeding the team physically, and they're feeding the team spiritually, and it's working both ways. They're having a great time of it.